From folklore and fairies
to monsters and mysteries, it came from the Maritimes. Gently rapping at my chamber door, introducing my co-host, Chelsea.
Emerging from the ocean waves, here is my co-host, Evan.
Welcome to our second episode of It Came From The Maritimes. Today we will be talking about the White Point Beach ghosts. This is a place that's pretty personal to us growing up. We spent a lot of time there, going every summer. I don't think I've personally experienced any of the ghosts myself, but I know in the mornings it's pretty foggy and eerie in the area, so I'm not surprised to hear there are some.
Right, one of my most vivid memories of going to White Point when we were kids is once a week they would have this island campover where a few of the camp counselors would essentially load up all the kids whose parents had signed them up, canoe us out to an island in the middle of the lake, and we would have a campfire, set up tents, and have this overnight sleepover. Now, I feel like this is not an event that would fly today, but at the time, I guarantee our mom appreciated the night off. Evan, do you remember these campouts?
I do. I remember going to them every year, and I think there was only one night where they didn't need to bring me back to my mom because I was afraid.
So I do remember there was one night that the counselor was canoeing Evan back to shore to take him back to my mom's cabin, and they just left me in the tent alone. So I woke up on this island by myself and there was no canoe there, and I genuinely thought that I had been abandoned on the island. And in reality, when I say it was in the middle of the lake, it was maybe like 50 meters out. So I easily could have swam, but I was just in a state about it.
I was just thinking that you made it sound like it's really far. I think 50 meters even is an exaggeration for how far it was from the shore. It was a pretty quick trip because they would need to go back and forth if there was more than like 3 kids.
But I mean, when you're a kid, you feel like you're like, it might as well be in the middle of the ocean when you're on this like small wooded island by yourself.
Oh yeah, and the island was like by itself just kind of spooky. It was a bunch of old dead pine trees and just like a campfire there, and they had just told us a bunch of scary stories right before, so you're not feeling super excited to be alone in the woods.
So there was one story in particular that really stood out to me. And this is one that it actually had me like tiptoeing around the lodge during my childhood at White Point because I was so worried about running into this ghost myself. I even ended up writing a story about it when I was a kid because I was just, it had such a lasting effect on me. So today I'm going to be telling you that ghost story and then a few others that I've found in my research. Are you ready, Evan?
I'm always ready.
Excellent. So a little background on White Point Beach Resort for those who haven't had the pleasure of visiting it themselves. White Point Beach Resort has stood overlooking the roaring Atlantic Ocean on the south shore of Nova Scotia for almost a century. It was originally built in 1928 as a seasonal lodge for hunting and fishing, but it quickly became a family destination, enticing folks to visit its 1-kilometer white sand beach, its saltwater lake, and the beautiful balsam forest surrounding it. White Point evolved to a year-round vacation spot, and as someone who has visited it in both the summer and winter, I can testify to its beauty regardless of the month. The original main lodge sadly perished on November 12, 2011 during a fire, but they rebuilt and opened the new lodge 1 year later. Even though the original building was burnt to ash, the spirits of people who spent their lives dedicated to White Point Beach Resort have lingered on the property, and some can still be seen today. The ghost story that I remember from our childhood, the one that captivated me from such a young age, is the story of Ivy Elliott. Ivy was the wife of Harvey Elliott, an early owner of the lodge. The Elliots ran the lodge for about 40 years, from the 1930s to the 1970s. Ivy was a thin, tall woman with long brown hair who was known for her love of flowers and her talent as a piano player. Now, Ivy managed the dining room, and she was known to be incredibly strict. She took so much pride in White Point's food and beverage department that if someone didn't live up to her high standards, she would let them know. She was a tough boss with a shrewd eye. Her work hours were during the day, but she would stay in the lodge at night so she could monitor the dining room and her staff. If the dining room setup wasn't flawless, She was even known to fling a piece of misplaced cutlery at the person who had set it down. Can you imagine that, Evan?
I honestly can't. That sounds, even as a living person, she sounds pretty terrifying.
Right? She would have been a lot to deal with if you were an employee there.
Really, though.
So Ivy passed away from natural causes. And after her passing, it seemed that she was reluctant to give up her duties at the lodge. Employees have reported mislaid utensils being moved on the table or even thrown across the room at the head of the culprit who set them incorrectly. Dining room staff have also, after setting a table, left the room and returned to see the napkins rearranged. This happens especially at table 25, which was Ivy's favorite table. Employees who work in the dining room late at night have heard footsteps crossing from the entrance of the room towards the kitchen, even when they're the only ones left in the lodge. And one person even reported the spectre of Ivy, sitting at her favorite table in the dining hall, staring out at the waves. A former kitchen employee, April, has witnessed multiple strange occurrences. One night, she was alone in the lodge at 2 a.m. doing inventory when she heard music and laughter downstairs. She went to investigate, but no one was there. When she returned to the dining hall, she saw that utensils, which had been firmly placed on S-hooks the night before, had been thrown on the floor. The next night, she was alone in the lodge and about to leave, and she heard a woman's voice whisper in her ear, "Check the lights." She felt panicked, but returned to the dining room, and she had actually left the lights on. I think of all the possible ghostly encounters, whispering in my ear, was probably like the scariest thing that could happen to me.
Yeah, I don't want a regular person whispering in my ear. So I definitely don't want a ghost just sneaking up to me.
Right? There's something about whispering. I'm not a fan.
Yeah.
Now, a former chef at White Point had some encounters of his own. On multiple occasions, he had heard the piano being played late at night, but whenever he entered the games room, the playing would stop. So Ivy clearly didn't want an audience. One of the encounters that I would have the hardest time explaining away is a former waitress one night had the dining room television on as background noise when she balanced the books, and she was alone in the room and saw the stool next to her be pulled back as if someone was pulling it out to sit next to her. She panicked and decided to call it a night, so she turned the TV off with the remote, and as soon as she turned it off, it would turn back on. This happened a couple of times until she finally gave up and decided to just leave and let Ivy watch her television.
You see, that television one is scary, but what you mentioned with the piano in the games room, when you mentioned her, the first thing I thought when you mentioned piano player was that game room piano. And I don't know why. Maybe I had heard that part of the story before, but there was like nothing in my mind that could. But I always felt that piano was just a little bit weird. So
Right? And that was one of the tidbits that I remembered from the stories we were told by the counselors when we were kids, is that the piano would play by itself. And I'm probably like misremembering or making this up, but now it's like I remember being in the lodge and like being so concerned that I had heard that playing when no one was in the games room.
yeah, because we would tend to be there earlier than most people would be up, and I remember being afraid of that piano. So it must have just been based on those stories that we heard. But yeah,
Right? It's spooky stuff. Now, sightings of Ivy, they weren't just limited to the dining room. Two former groundskeepers once showed up early on a winter morning to plow the driveway after a big snowfall. They were shocked when they spotted footsteps in the snow leading up to the open door of the main lodge. This was before the lodge was operated year-round, so no one else should have been there that day. They peered inside and they saw pools of freshly melted snow on the floor outside the dining room. They called out and no one answered, so they searched the lodge and grounds thoroughly because they wanted to make sure no one had broken in. There was no evidence of anyone having been to the lodge that day, so it seems that not even a snowstorm could keep Ivy from her after-death dining room responsibilities. One of the maintenance staff at White Point, named Bruce, has twice seen the figure of a woman who he believes to be Ivy. One time, a woman with brown hair wearing a thin coat passed him when he was salting the driveway on a snowy night. She was walking towards the main lodge and didn't acknowledge him when he asked her, "It's an awful cold night, isn't it?" He was concerned about her being outside without proper clothing, so he followed her and she disappeared just as he was about to catch up to her. The second time he spotted her, he had been climbing the staff section of the stairs, and he saw a figure appear at the top of them. The figure brushed quickly past him, heading towards the kitchen so quickly that he couldn't get a good glimpse. As this brushed past, he was overwhelmed by a cold sensation. It's not just employees of the lodge who have had their weird encounters. Guests of White Point Beach Resort who stayed in room 212 in the old lodge have made complaints of the lights in their room flashing on and off. One guest had a more vivid experience. He once reported that he rolled over in bed, expecting to see the bathroom mirror from his angle, but when he opened his eyes, he saw that it had been replaced by the painting of a young woman with flowers woven in her long brown hair. People who were at the lodge when Ivy was alive reported that this is where she used to keep this portrait of herself, her favorite painting that had been done of her. Now, when he kind of shook his head and looked more closely, the painting was gone and the mirror was back. But that's just such a specific moment, like who would know that? Now, another guest once woke up and saw a woman standing over him, and he also reported that she wore flowers in her hair. I take back what I said. I think I'd rather not see a woman standing over my bed. I'd prefer the whispering in my ears.
I feel like whispering you can kind of explain away. You can be like, oh, that was quiet, so it must be someone far away just saying something. But someone standing over you, there's really no explaining that one away.
Right, it would be quite jarring. Now, it turns out that Ivy hasn't made a reappearance since the old lodge that she loves so much burned down. But who knows? Maybe one day she will make her presence known again. This was the only ghost story that I actually vividly remembered from the camp nights that we went to at White Point. But there were a few more that I ended up finding in my research. Now, Evan, do you remember hearing any other ghost stories, or was Ivy the one that stood out to you?
Honestly, I barely even remember hearing Ivy. I think I was so afraid of the ghost stories in general that I would kind of just shut it out. The main thing, I remember hearing one of those classic hook hand in the car door stories at one of those camps. And that's kind of the classic one you hear everywhere. But I can't say I've heard any other ones that I can remember. But it was a long time ago, so who knows?
Right, well, it's your lucky day because I'm going to share the stories of some of the other spirits who haunt the property. So those who have been to White Point Beach Resort know that it doesn't only have its main lodge, but it has many cottage properties along the ocean and the lake. We were very lucky when we were children. We always stayed in one of the oceanfront cottages, and I remember loving it because I used to peek outside the window first thing. I'd always want the bed right next to the front window because I'd be hoping to spot a mermaid in the ocean. No sightings as of yet, but there's still time. But it turns out these cottages had a lasting impact on one of the employees who used to work at White Point. Danny Boone was the caretaker at White Point, and he lived in cabin 137. He was actually good friends with Ivy, and they were known to go for walks together on the local nature path that winds along the ocean. After Ivy passed away, Danny was seen sitting alone at his table, talking to himself. If someone asked who he was talking to, he would just tell them that Ivy had dropped by for a visit. He loved the property and spent a lot of his life there, so it's no surprise that when he passed away, his spirit wasn't ready to depart. His ghost has been seen walking on the trails, also standing or sitting in front of his cabin, sometimes rocking in a chair or raking leaves. One couple thinks that they spotted the ghosts of both Danny and Ivy one foggy night. They were on a late-night beach stroll, and they saw a man and woman emerge from the fog. They waved hello, and the couple turned around, disappearing into the mist. If you approach Danny, he either fades away before you reach him, or he steps behind a tree and disappears. But he is usually seen with his good friend Ivy. Now, there is one more spirit that's been seen at the lodge, and this story is on a slightly sadder note. So the other spirit that guests and employees of the lodge have reported seeing is that of a young boy. His name has sadly been forgotten with time, but he is thought to be a spirit of a 9-year-old boy whose family lived near the lodge. He spent a lot of time in the ocean, taking his raft out to one of the nearby islands where he and his friends had built a cabin. Sadly, the Atlantic Ocean is unpredictable, and one day he was alone on his raft when he was swept out into the ocean by a rogue current and was carried so far away that no one could reach him. He lost control of his raft and drowned, and his body was never recovered. When spotted, He is usually perched on the boulders lining the beach, out on his raft in the ocean, or standing in the boathouse, staring out the window at the water. The one constant is that he's always seen wearing overalls and a white shirt. A few folks have had interactive encounters with the young ghost. Bruce, the same employee from before who's encountered Ivy, had an encounter with this young spirit as well. One day, one of his co-workers asked for help dragging a boat ashore. He and his co-worker were two strong men, but they couldn't get the boat to budge. It was about 10 feet out in the water, and no matter how hard they pulled on the rope, they couldn't get it to move closer to shore. Bruce assumed that the boat had gotten stuck on something, a piece of driftwood maybe, a rock, so he decided to get in his canoe and go investigate. As he was getting the canoe, he heard a young boy laughing behind him and turned around. He and his co-worker looked in the boat, and there was a young boy in overalls sitting in it, holding onto the rope and pulling it away from them, preventing them from pulling the boat towards shore. The two men looked at each other, wondering how a young boy had gotten into the boat without them noticing, and when they turned back to the boat, he had disappeared.
Honestly, that one, I kind of like that one. It's kind of sweet in its own sad way. Like, he's still
Right?
having fun.
And that's what makes me kind of happy, that it's like, it's tragic that he died at such a young age, but if this is his spirit, at least he's having like a great time now.
Yeah.
Now, Bruce had another anecdote about this young ghost. Apparently, there was a young couple that had gone on a boat trip, and they had been passing a local island when they saw a young boy in overalls and a white shirt waving at them from the shoreline. They asked if he needed a ride back to the mainland, but he just kept waving. A crew member got in a canoe and paddled to the island, hoping to offer some assistance, but by the time he reached the shore, the boy had disappeared. Now, people watching from the boat saw him literally just vanish, so it's not like he ran into the woods. There was just no sign of him. The crew member walked up and down the shoreline and was surprised to note that there were no footsteps. So, this young boy ghost, he gets around the White Point area.
Yeah, no kidding.
Islands, boathouses, he's all over the place. Now, this might be my nostalgia talking, but White Point Beach Resort, it is one of those places that feels magical. The sound of the ocean and the crisp sea air alone are reason enough to visit. But when you factor in the friendly South Shore atmosphere and the gorgeous surrounding scenery, I can understand why a spirit would find it difficult to leave. So Evan, what do you think? Now that you've heard the other tales, do you think there's any other spirits of White Point you might have encountered?
I don't think so. I'm sorry if I've been a little distracted. I was looking up where cabin 137 was to see if it was one that we had stayed in before, but it's on the other side of the property from where we usually were.
I was thinking back, and it might have been the first year we stayed there. We stayed in one of the cabins that was kind of further up. So there's that little piece of me that always wonders.
Yeah, I know. I'm just kind of thinking like, oh no, then I mean, maybe we did see him and we just didn't even know.
Well, that's it. We just assumed it was a caretaker.
I remember my main concern was always there would be little spots for storage in the cabins where you just couldn't see into. I was always afraid there were some sort of monsters hiding there, but that was more of a little kid afraid of monsters under the bed type of thing than anything else, I think.
Well, that's it. And I remember the closets. They had this like little kind of wooden perch that were meant to be like you could put your suitcase up there. But I was always like, nah, there's a monster up there. Like,
No,
there's gotta be.
That's what I was thinking of exactly. I used to jump up on the beds and jump up to try to see above them just to make sure there was nothing hiding up there.
It's a wonder we have so many fond memories of this place.
So to say, we're apparently both paranoid in the same way because I've never talked about that to you.
Me neither. I love White Point, and I'm going to be going back at least for a one night this summer, and I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes out for some of these spirits, see if they're hanging out. I do want to give credit to two books that I got most of these stories from. Destination White Point by Frances Jewell Dickson had a lot of information about the history of the lodge and a lot of the ghostly encounters as well. The rest of the stories I got from Where the Ghosts Are by Steve Vernon. He has some great content in his books. Like a lot of the stories that I've read about Nova Scotia folklore come from his novels.
Honestly, Steve Vernon and Helen Creighton, you're going to be hearing their names a lot.
Yeah, this is essentially a fan podcast regarding them to an extent, but don't worry, we do a lot of our own research too. On top of those two wonderful authors, I would also like to thank the previous counselors at White Point Beach Resort for terrifying us as children and likely contributing further to our love of Nova Scotia folklore.
I actually would like to the opposite of thank them for all the nightmares I had over the years.
There's a reason he couldn't last an overnight camping trip on the island.
I made it on one of them out of probably like 8.
1 out of 8, that's not bad.
Not a great record.
Well, it's a testament to how scary the stories were. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on this episode of It Came From The Maritimes. You can find us on social media, Instagram and Facebook at It Came From The Maritimes, on X at ICFT Maritimes. And if you have any Atlantic Canada folklore you'd like to see covered in future episodes, please email us at itcameFromTheMaritimes@gmail.com.
We'd like to end the episode with a folklore tip. The one for this episode is painting your front door blue will help keep spirits away.
Maybe White Point should try this with their lodge and cottages in the future.
I agree.